Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The Thornfield estate stood like a silent sentinel at the end of a winding path lined with weeping willows, their branches forming a natural canopy that seemed to whisper secrets to those who passed beneath. Located in Albemarle County, Virginia, the Grand Plantation House was once the pride of the region, its white columns gleaming in the southern sun, its gardens meticulously maintained by dozens of hands that belonged to people who were not free. In 1842, this estate became the setting for one of the most disturbing psychological horror stories ever documented in American history, though few know the complete truth of what transpired behind those elegant walls. The story begins with a discovery made in 1961 by Professor Martin Caldwell of the University of Virginia while researching antebellum plantation correspondence for his doctoral thesis. In the university archives, filed away and nearly forgotten, was a collection of letters, diary entries, and county records that had been donated by the descendants of the Thornfield family in 1927, with the stipulation that they remain sealed for 30 years. What Professor Caldwell found within those papers would haunt him for the remainder of his life, so much so that he abandoned his original research focus and spent the next 7 years piecing together the tragic and disturbing events that unfolded at Thornfield in 1842. The mistress of Thornfield was Elizabeth Thornfield, who at 32 years of age had inherited the estate following the unexpected death of her husband, Colonel James Thornfield, during a hunting expedition in 1841. The official county record listed his cause of death as an accidental discharge of his rifle, though whispers among the household staff suggested otherwise. Elizabeth was known throughout the county for her refined manners, her education having been completed at one of the finest women's academies in Philadelphia, and her seemingly gentle handling of the plantation's affairs. But the documents discovered by Professor Caldwell told a different story. Elizabeth's private journal, bound in leather that had cracked with age, revealed a woman struggling with the weight of her position. "I find myself a widow in possession of an estate I never wished to govern," she wrote in an entry dated January 12, 1842. "The responsibilities fall heavy upon my shoulders, and I fear I am not equal to the task that God has set before me." What makes this case particularly unsettling is the stark transformation documented in Elizabeth's writings over the course of that fateful year. Her initial entries display the expected grief of a new widow, concern over managing the estate's finances, and observations about the changing seasons. By spring, however, her attention had turned almost exclusively to one subject, a man known in her earliest entries only as S. County records identified S as Samuel, a skilled craftsman who had been purchased by Colonel Thornfield in 1838 from a plantation in North Carolina. According to the inventory of the estate following the colonel's death, Samuel was valued at a considerably high sum due to his abilities as a carpenter and his literacy, an unusual and often forbidden skill among enslaved people at that time. Elizabeth's journal entries suggest that following her husband's death, she relied increasingly on Samuel's knowledge to maintain the structural integrity of the aging plantation house, S. His understanding of such matters exceeds that of the overseer, though I dare not say so openly. The tone of Elizabeth's writing about Samuel gradually shifts in a manner that Professor Caldwell described in his notes as deeply concerning and psychologically revealing. By April, she had begun to document their conversations in meticulous detail, noting the cadence of his speech, the careful way he chose his words when addressing her, and increasingly her own emotional responses to their interactions, has identified the source of the perpetual dampness in the East Wing, she wrote in March. He suggests a fault in the foundation that can be remedied before the summer rains. A letter found among the papers from Elizabeth's sister in Boston reveals the first indication that something unusual was occurring at Thornfield. "Your last correspondence troubles me greatly," wrote Margaret Wilcox to her sister on May 10th. "You speak of isolation and loneliness, yet refuse my invitation to visit us in the city where you might find suitable companionship. I fear that your seclusion on that plantation, surrounded only by servants and slaves, may be affecting your sensibilities in ways that would not occur in proper society." The most disturbing evidence came in the form of a small leather-bound notebook, separate from Elizabeth's main journal, in which she began recording what she called her private thoughts, beginning in June 1842. The entries are initially coded using a simple letter substitution that Professor Caldwell was able to decipher. The decoded contents revealed Elizabeth's growing obsession with Samuel, describing in increasingly intimate detail her observations of him as he worked around the estate. "I watched from the second-floor gallery as S. repaired the garden trellis today," reads one decoded entry from June 18th. "The summer heat caused him to remove his shirt, revealing scars across his back that I had not previously observed. I found myself unable to look away, wondering at the pain that had been inflicted upon him, and experiencing an unfamiliar sensation that I dare not name even in these private pages." What followed over the next months was a psychological descent that observers today might recognize as a dangerous combination of power, isolation, and obsession. Elizabeth began creating situations that required Samuel's presence in the main house, assigning him projects that kept him within her sight for extended periods. The overseer, Thomas Wilkins, noted his concerns in a ledger found among the estate papers, writing that Mrs. T.T. has taken an unusual interest in the management of the house repairs, particularly those conducted by the slave Samuel, which is causing unease among the household staff. By August, Elizabeth had dismissed the overseer, citing financial constraints as her reason. Without this layer of supervision, the dynamics at Thornfield shifted dramatically. Elizabeth's coded journal entries become more explicit, describing fantasies and desires that would have been considered not merely inappropriate, but potentially dangerous in the context of 1842 Virginia society, where laws and social codes strictly forbade any such relationship between a white woman and an enslaved man. The psychological horror of this story lies not in supernatural elements or graphic violence, but in the documented descent of Elizabeth Thornfield into what can only be described as a form of madness, born of power, isolation, and forbidden desire. Her writings reveal a woman increasingly detached from reality, constructing elaborate justifications for her feelings and actions. "I believe that Providence has placed S. in my path for a divine purpose," she wrote in September. "Is it not written that all men are equal in the eyes of the Lord? Yet society would condemn what God himself may have ordained." The papers suggest that Samuel was placed in an impossible situation, trapped between the power Elizabeth held over his very life and her growing demands for emotional and eventually physical intimacy. Several pages appear to have been torn from Elizabeth's coded journal during the month of October, leaving gaps in the narrative that Professor Caldwell filled with information gleaned from other sources. A letter from a neighboring plantation owner, Mrs. Caroline Shelby, to her sister in Richmond mentions strange rumors circulating about the widow Thornfield and her unusual management of her household affairs. "She has not been seen at church these past 3 Sundays, and when I called upon her yesterday, I was told by a house servant that she was indisposed. I caught sight of her watching me from an upstairs window as I departed, though she made no effort to acknowledge me." The most chilling document in the collection is a statement given to the county sheriff on November 12, 1842, by Abigail, a house servant at Thornfield. Her account describes finding Elizabeth in the library late one evening, engaged in what Abigail carefully termed inappropriate familiarities with Samuel. According to Abigail's statement, when Elizabeth realized they had been discovered, she flew into a rage, accusing Samuel of forcing himself upon her. The county records show that Samuel was arrested that same night and held in the local jail. Elizabeth's formal accusation, written in a hand noticeably different from her journal entries, more erratic and hurried, claimed that he had developed an unnatural fixation on her and had threatened her with harm if she did not submit to his advances. The psychological terror of this narrative reaches its peak when comparing Elizabeth's public accusation with an entry in her coded journal dated November 13th, the day after Samuel's arrest. "What choice did I have?" she wrote. "When Abigail discovered us, I saw in her eyes the judgment of the entire world. I could not bear it. The words left my mouth before I could stop them. Now he sits in that horrible jail, and it is by my hand that he is there. Yet what else could I have done? Society would destroy us both otherwise." Samuel never received a trial. According to the sheriff's records, he was found dead in his cell on November 15th, officially recorded as having taken his own life, though the details provided are suspiciously sparse. A single note in the margin of the report, added in a different hand, states only, "Rope provided by unknown visitor previous evening." The aftermath of these events is documented in a series of increasingly disturbed journal entries by Elizabeth. Her writing becomes erratic, shifting between profound grief, paranoia, and disturbing rationalizations. "They watch me from every corner of the house," she wrote on November 20th. "The servants, the field hands, even the neighboring families. They know something, but not the truth. Never the truth. Only S. knew the truth of my heart, and now he is gone." By December, Elizabeth had dismissed most of the household staff, retaining only an elderly cook and a young house servant. Her final journal entry, dated December 24, 1842, reads, "I hear him in the halls at night, his footsteps on the stairs. Sometimes I think I see him standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with those eyes that saw too much, knew too much. Is this my punishment, or is he waiting for me to join him?" Professor Caldwell's research notes indicate that he was unable to find any further personal writings from Elizabeth after this date. County records show that the Thornfield estate was sold in March 1843 to a merchant from Richmond, with Elizabeth relocating to her sister's home in Boston. A letter from Margaret Wilcox to a friend, dated September 1843, mentions that Elizabeth remains in a fragile state, speaking little and startling at the slightest sound. The doctors have recommended quiet and seclusion, though I fear she has had too much of both already. The final document in the collection is a death certificate for Elizabeth Thornfield, dated May 17, 1844, listing the cause as brain fever, a common diagnosis of the time for a variety of mental and neurological conditions. She was buried in Boston, far from the Thornfield family plot where generations of her husband's family lay. What makes this case particularly haunting is not just the tragic events themselves, but the psychological portrait they paint of a woman trapped within the confines of her society who abused her power in pursuit of forbidden desires, and who ultimately destroyed both the object of her affection and herself. The collection of documents presents a study in psychological deterioration, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the corrosive effects of a society built on fundamental inequality and injustice. But there is more to this story that was only discovered in 1963, when a historian researching the architectural history of plantation homes in Virginia came across a previously overlooked set of documents in the Richmond Historical Society. These papers, belonging to Dr. E. William Hayes, a physician who had attended to the Thornfield household during the summer and fall of 1842, shed new light on the psychological state of Elizabeth Thornfield in the months leading up to the tragic events of November. Dr. Hayes kept meticulous records of his house calls, and his notes on Elizabeth describe a woman suffering from what he termed nervous exhaustion and melancholia, conditions he attributed to her recent widowhood and the burden of managing the plantation. However, in his private correspondence with a colleague in Philadelphia, Hayes expressed deeper concerns. I fear that Mrs. Thornfield's condition goes beyond the normal grief of widowhood, he wrote on September 3, 1842. She exhibits symptoms of a disordered mind, including periods of unusual animation followed by profound despondency. During my last visit, she spoke at length about dreams in which her deceased husband accused her of unnamed betrayals. Most concerning is her fixation on one of her house slaves, whom she mentioned no fewer than 7 times during our conversation, though always in reference to repairs being made to the house. There is something in her manner when she speaks of him that I find difficult to define, but nonetheless troubling. Dr. Hayes's notes also include a curious entry from October 15th, in which he records prescribing Elizabeth a tincture of laudanum for her increasingly disturbed sleep and nervous agitation. He notes that she claimed to hear footsteps in the hallways at night and voices whispering behind the walls of her bedroom. When I suggested that such experiences might be the product of an overtaxed mind, she became quite agitated, insisting that the house itself was witnessing and judging her actions, and that the very walls had eyes. This reference to the house as a witnessing entity appears repeatedly in Elizabeth's later journal entries, suggesting a growing paranoia and possibly guilt over her developing feelings for Samuel. In one particularly disturbing passage from late October, she wrote, "The house knows, it has always known. Every board, every nail, every stone in the foundation was placed by hands like his, and they remember. They watch me as I move through these rooms, judging what they see in my heart." The Thornfield plantation house itself was an imposing structure, built in 1789 by Elizabeth's husband's grandfather. According to architectural records, it was constructed in the Palladian style popular among Virginia's wealthy planters, featuring a central block with symmetrical wings extending to either side. The east wing, which Elizabeth frequently mentioned in her journals as being plagued by dampness, had been added in 1812 and housed the library where, according to Abigail's testimony, the fateful discovery of Elizabeth and Samuel occurred. A survey of the property conducted in 1835, found among Colonel Thornfield's papers, indicates that beneath the east wing was an extensive cellar, unusual for Virginia plantations of the period due to the high water table in many areas. This cellar was accessed by a narrow staircase hidden behind a panel in the library, and was used primarily for storage of wines and preserved foods. In Elizabeth's later journal entries, she makes several references to this cellar, describing it as that dark mouth beneath the house, waiting to swallow secrets. Following the sale of the property in 1843, the new owner, merchant Richard Holloway, commissioned a renovation of the house, during which workers made a disturbing discovery. According to a letter Holloway wrote to his brother in April 1843, the workmen removing the old paneling in the library uncovered a most peculiar and unsettling sight. In the narrow space between the inner and outer walls, they found dozens of small objects that appeared to have been deliberately hidden there. A man's handkerchief, a carved wooden figure, several folded notes, the contents of which I will not describe here, as they are of an intimate and disturbing nature, and most bizarrely, a lock of dark hair tied with blue ribbon. The foreman suggests that such items might have been placed there as some form of folk magic practiced by the servants, but I find this explanation unsatisfactory. I have had all the items removed and burned, and instructed the men not to speak of their discovery. This finding suggests that Elizabeth may have been hiding physical mementos of her relationship with Samuel within the very walls of the house, creating a literal manifestation of her journal metaphor about the house knowing and remembering her secrets. The psychological implications of such behavior, concealing evidence of forbidden desire within the structure that represented her social position and authority, speak to the profound conflict between her private emotions and her public role. Another significant document discovered by Professor Caldwell was a letter from Elizabeth to her sister Margaret, written, but apparently never sent, dated November 10, 1842, just 2 days before Samuel's arrest. The letter reveals Elizabeth's deteriorating mental state and suggests she may have been contemplating a drastic action. My dearest Margaret, I write to you in a state of mind that I can scarcely describe. The walls of this house close in upon me daily. I feel watched, judged, condemned by forces both seen and unseen. Yet within this prison I have discovered a freedom of feeling that I never imagined possible. You would not understand. Indeed, I hardly understand it myself. But I believe I have found a path forward, though it leads away from everything I have known. By the time you receive this letter, I will have taken steps that cannot be undone. Do not judge me harshly. Some cages once recognized cannot be endured a moment longer. I go to seek a life of my own choosing, whatever the cost. The reference to steps that cannot be undone and a path forward suggests Elizabeth may have been planning to flee the plantation with Samuel, an action that would have been not only socially ruinous, but potentially illegal under the laws of Virginia at that time. The fact that this letter was never sent, combined with the events that unfolded just days later, suggests that Elizabeth's plans, whatever they might have been, were interrupted by Abigail's discovery of her relationship with Samuel. The psychological tension evident in this unsent letter is palpable. Elizabeth appears torn between a desperate desire for escape and a paralyzing fear of judgment. The metaphor of the house as both prison and witness recurs, reinforcing the sense that the physical structure of Thornfield had become, in Elizabeth's increasingly disturbed mind, a manifestation of the social constraints and moral judgments that she simultaneously resented and internalized. Dr. Eleanor Jenkins, in her analysis of the case, suggests that this architectural metaphor is key to understanding Elizabeth's psychological descent. The house, with its hidden spaces, false panels, and secret stairways, becomes a physical representation of Elizabeth's psyche, parts visible and acceptable to society, parts hidden and forbidden. As her forbidden desires grow, she increasingly perceives the house itself as animated, watchful, judgmental, projecting her own internal conflicts onto the physical space around her. This interpretation gains additional support from a series of sketches found among Elizabeth's papers, dated throughout the summer and fall of 1842. The drawings, which Professor Caldwell described as displaying a disturbing technical precision despite their bizarre content, depict the Thornfield house with subtle but unsettling alterations. Windows positioned like watching eyes, doorways shaped like gaping mouths, columns twisted like restraining arms. In one particularly striking image from October, Elizabeth drew the house with a human heart, visible within its central structure, veins and arteries extending throughout the building like the roots of a tree. These visual representations of Thornfield as a living, watching entity parallel the increasingly paranoid tone of Elizabeth's journal entries during the same period. By early November, she had begun to record what she called conversations with the house itself. It speaks to me now not in words, but in creaks and sighs, the settling of old wood in the night, the whisper of draft through hallways. It knows what I have done, what I plan to do. It has witnessed generations of my husband's family and their cruelties, their hypocrisies, their secret shames. Now it witnesses mine. I asked it last night. The absurdity of this does not escape me, even in my current state, if it would betray me. The wind rose suddenly, rattling the windows like a warning. Such passages reveal a mind increasingly detached from reality, personifying the physical structure around her as both confident and potential betrayer. Dr. Hayes, in his correspondence, noted this tendency as particularly concerning. Mrs. Thornfield speaks of the house as one might speak of a living being, with intentions and judgments. When I attempted to redirect her thoughts, she became quite insistent, claiming that I, too, was in league with the walls and floorboards. I fear her isolation has allowed these fancies to take root too deeply for conventional treatment to be effective. The architectural layout of Thornfield itself may have contributed to Elizabeth's psychological deterioration. Historical records indicate that the master's quarters were located in the central block of the house, while the servants' quarters were primarily in the west wing, with the east wing containing the library, music room, and several rarely used guest chambers. This arrangement created a physical separation between Elizabeth and most of the household staff, increasing her isolation, particularly after she dismissed many of the servants in the months following her husband's death. Professor Caldwell's notes include a floor plan of Thornfield, reconstructed from various documents and accounts. He marks Elizabeth's bedchamber on the second floor of the central block, directly above the formal parlor, where she would receive the increasingly infrequent visitors from neighboring plantations. Significantly, the library where Elizabeth and Samuel were discovered is positioned at the furthest point of the east wing, separated from the main house activities and servant traffic, offering both privacy and isolation, a physical reflection of the psychological and social separation that Elizabeth was experiencing. The fate of Samuel, beyond his reported suicide in the county jail, remains one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. The official report contains suspiciously few details, and Professor Caldwell notes several inconsistencies that suggest the full truth may have been deliberately obscured. The sheriff's log indicates that Samuel had no visitors on November 14th, yet the margin note about a rope provided by unknown visitor contradicts this. Additionally, the cell in which Samuel was held was described in county records as having a ceiling too low for effective hanging, raising questions about the reported method of suicide. A church record from the local black cemetery indicates that Samuel's body was buried in an unmarked grave on November 16th, with no funeral service or mourners noted. This hasty and secretive disposal suggests a desire by local authorities to put the matter to rest quickly and quietly, without drawing attention to the circumstances of his death or the allegations that led to his arrest. Elizabeth's coded journal entry from November 17th contains a passage that has led some researchers, including Dr. Jenkins, to question the official account of Samuel's death. They tell me he is gone by his own hand, but I know this cannot be true. S. would never abandon our plan so readily. I fear a darker hand in this matter, perhaps even that of J from beyond the grave. The house has had its revenge on us both. The reference to J presumably indicates Elizabeth's deceased husband, Colonel James Thornfield, suggesting that, in her increasingly paranoid state, Elizabeth believed her husband's spirit or legacy was somehow responsible for Samuel's death. More significantly, the mention of our plan supports the theory that Elizabeth and Samuel had indeed been contemplating escape together, as hinted at in her unsent letter to Margaret. Dr. Jenkins suggests that Elizabeth's mental deterioration following Samuel's death may have been exacerbated by guilt over her false accusation, combined with genuine grief and possibly suspicion about the true circumstances of his death. The cognitive dissonance would have been extreme, Jenkins writes. Having betrayed the man she had come to love in a moment of panic, then potentially suspecting or knowing that her accusation led directly to his murder rather than suicide, all while maintaining the social facade required of a woman in her position, these contradictions would create an unbearable psychological burden. Elizabeth's decision to sell Thornfield and return to Boston just months after these events suggests an attempt to escape the physical location of her trauma and guilt. However, Margaret's letter indicates that the psychological damage had already been done. Elizabeth's withdrawal, her startling it sounds, and her general fragility, as described by her sister, all point to what modern clinicians might diagnose as post-traumatic stress disorder complicated by pre-existing depression and possible psychotic episodes. A particularly intriguing document discovered by Professor Caldwell in 1960s was a small, leather-bound book among the personal effects of Dr. Hayes, which had been donated to the Richmond Medical Society after his death in 1867. The book contains what appears to be private notes on various patients, including several entries about Elizabeth Thornfield that were not included in his official medical records. In an entry dated October 27, 1842, just 2 weeks before the fateful discovery in the library, Hayes wrote, "Visited Thornfield today at Mrs. T's request. Found her in a state of considerable agitation, claiming to have heard voices emanating from within the walls of her bedchamber. Upon examination, discovered nothing unusual, though the house is certainly old enough to produce strange acoustics. What troubles me more than these apparent auditory hallucinations is Mrs. T's insistence that the voices are speaking directly to her, commenting on her private thoughts and actions. When pressed, she would not specify the nature of these comments, saying only that the house disapproves. I have increased her laudanum dosage, though I fear this may exacerbate rather than alleviate her confused mental state." A subsequent entry, dated November 5th, records, "Called to Thornfield unexpectedly. Mrs. T had apparently suffered what her servants described as a fit of hysteria after discovering a hidden compartment in the paneling of her husband's former study. According to the house servant who witnessed the episode, Mrs. T became extremely agitated upon finding what appeared to be a collection of letters hidden within the wall. She refused to allow anyone to see the contents of these letters, immediately burning them in the fireplace. When I arrived, I found her remarkably calm, almost unnaturally so, though her pupils were dilated and her speech somewhat disjointed. She denied any knowledge of the incident described by her servants, insisting that she had simply been conversing with the house about its secrets. I am increasingly concerned about her mental condition, particularly given her isolation and the apparent absence of proper supervision since the dismissal of the overseer. These entries suggest that Elizabeth may have discovered something about her late husband in the weeks before her relationship with Samuel was exposed, perhaps evidence of similar transgressions or other damning secrets. The psychological impact of such a discovery, particularly if it revealed hypocrisy on the part of Colonel Thornfield, might have served to both justify Elizabeth's feelings for Samuel in her own mind and increase her paranoia about being discovered. The conversations with the house that Dr. Hayes mentions appear with increasing frequency in Elizabeth's own journals during this period. On November 7th, she wrote, "The house revealed another of Jay's secrets today. How many more lie hidden in these walls? How many other voices have been silenced? The house remembers them all, every touch, every whisper, every lie. It told me that what I feel for S is no different from what Jay felt for her, except that I do not hide behind cruelty and ownership as he did. The house says there is a way out for both of us, if I am brave enough to take it." The reference to her in this passage is cryptic, but a separate document discovered in the county records offers a possible explanation. In an inventory of Colonel Thornfield's estate, there is a notation regarding the sale of a female slave identified only as M in September 1840, approximately 1 year before the colonel's death. The sale price is recorded as well below the market value for an enslaved woman of working age, and the buyer is listed as a plantation owner in Louisiana, suggesting a hasty transaction and deliberate removal to a distant location. Professor Caldwell's research notes speculate that M may have been someone with whom Colonel Thornfield had developed an inappropriate relationship, similar to the one Elizabeth would later form with Samuel. If Elizabeth discovered evidence of such a relationship in the hidden letters mentioned by Dr. Hayes, it would add another layer to her psychological deterioration, the realization that her deceased husband, who had been respected and admired in their social circle, had engaged in the very behavior for which she now felt both desire and guilt. The theme of hidden spaces and secrets concealed within walls appears consistently throughout the documentation of the Thornfield case. In her dissertation, Dr. Jenkins suggests that this motif represents the psychological compartmentalization that both Elizabeth and the society around her engaged in, the separation of public facade from private reality, the containment of unacceptable desires, the deliberate concealment of truths that would disrupt the social order. The architecture of Thornfield, Jenkins writes, with its false panels, hidden staircases, and secrets embedded within walls, serves as a physical manifestation of the psychological architecture of its inhabitants and the society they represented, a structure built on denial, compartmentalization, and the burial of uncomfortable truths. Elizabeth's increasing identification with the house itself, her sense that it was alive, watching, judging, suggests a psychological projection of her own internal conflicts onto the physical structure around her. The house became, in her disturbed perception, both confidant and accuser, reflecting back to her the moral judgments she had internalized but could no longer reconcile with her desires. A particularly revealing entry in her coded journal, dated October 31, 1842, reads, "The house showed me a new room today. It has always been there, but I never saw the door until now. Inside is everything I was taught never to see, never to want, never to be. The room is filled with light of a kind I never knew existed. S waits for me there, not as he is in this world of walls and fences, but as he would be if the walls fell down, as I would be. The house says I can stay in this room forever, but only if I am willing to burn the rest down around me." This passage, with its imagery of a hidden room filled with light, suggests a psychological breakthrough, a vision of a world beyond the constraints of her society, where the relationship she desired might be possible. The reference to burning the rest down foreshadows the choice Elizabeth would soon face: to conform to social expectations at the cost of her desires, or to pursue those desires at the cost of everything else in her life. The metaphorical burning Elizabeth contemplated would become literal for Samuel, whose death in custody effectively closed the door to the room filled with light she had envisioned. The psychological aftermath of this loss, compounded by her own role in his arrest, appears to have shattered Elizabeth's already fragile mental state. In her final journal entries before leaving Thornfield, Elizabeth's writing becomes increasingly disjointed and surreal. On December 30th, 1842, she wrote, "The walls are thinning. I can see through them now to the other side. S stands there waiting. But each time I try to reach him, the walls solidify again. The house is laughing at me. It knew all along that there was no escape, not for people like us, not in this world. The voices in the walls have joined together now, a chorus that never ceases day or night. They sing of fire and freedom, of walls reduced to ash." Dr. Hayes was called to Thornfield one last time on January 15, 1843. In his official report, he noted that Elizabeth appeared severely malnourished and in a state of extreme nervous exhaustion, having apparently confined herself to her bedchamber for several weeks, refusing most food and sleep. He recommended immediate removal to a more suitable environment for treatment, which likely prompted her return to Boston under her sister's care. In his private notes, however, Hayes recorded a more disturbing assessment. Mrs. T seems to exist now in a world entirely of her own creation. She speaks constantly to people who are not present, primarily her deceased husband and the slave Samuel, conducting what appears to be a three-way conversation between herself, these absent figures, and the house itself. Most alarmingly, she repeatedly asked me if I could smell the smoke yet, insisting that the walls have already begun to burn. I fear that if she remains at Thornfield, she may pose a danger not only to herself but to the property and any who reside there. This concern about fire is particularly notable, given the ultimate fate of the Thornfield house, which would burn to the ground 70 years later under mysterious circumstances. Though Elizabeth was long dead by then, the coincidence of her fixation on burning walls and the house's eventual destruction by fire adds yet another unsettling layer to this psychological horror story. The Thornfield estate remained standing until 1913, when it was destroyed in a fire of unknown origin. Local newspaper accounts of the time report that the caretaker, an elderly man who lived alone on the property, claimed to have heard a woman's weeping and a man's footsteps the night before the blaze began. The property was never rebuilt and eventually became part of a larger agricultural holding, the foundation stones of the house gradually swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. A curious footnote to this story emerged in 1958 when a local historical society conducted an archaeological survey of the former Thornfield property. Among the charred remains and foundation stones, researchers discovered a small metal box that had apparently been concealed within the walls of the house. The box contained several items: a carved wooden figure similar to the one described in Richard Holloway's letter, a faded blue ribbon, and, most significantly, a folded piece of paper bearing what appeared to be a map of the plantation grounds with a location marked by a small X. Despite several attempts to locate whatever might be buried at the marked spot, nothing of significance was ever found. The archaeologist's report suggests that the landscape had changed too dramatically over the intervening century for accurate identification of the location, or that whatever had been buried there had long since decomposed or been removed. This discovery adds yet another layer to the psychological portrait of Elizabeth Thornfield, a woman who concealed physical tokens of her forbidden relationship within the very structure that symbolized her social position, perhaps as a form of defiance, perhaps as a way of making tangible a connection that society would not permit to exist openly. The map suggests a further secret, something buried on the property that may have held significance for Elizabeth and Samuel, though its nature remains unknown. Professor Caldwell's obsession with the Thornfield case took a toll on his own mental health, according to colleagues who worked with him during this period. Dr. Thomas Langford, a fellow historian at the University of Virginia, wrote in a 1968 memorandum recommending Caldwell's medical leave. Martin has become increasingly fixated on the psychological aspects of the Thornfield case, to the detriment of his other academic responsibilities and, I fear, his own well-being. He speaks of Elizabeth Thornfield as if she were a contemporary figure rather than a historical one, and has taken to visiting the former plantation site regularly, returning with soil samples and fragments of brick which he keeps arranged on his desk in patterns that make sense only to him. Most concerning is his claim that he has begun to hear the house speaking to him during these visits, despite the fact that the structure has been gone for over 50 years. This disturbing parallel between Caldwell's psychological state and that of Elizabeth Thornfield herself suggests the powerful pull that this story can exert on those who immerse themselves in its details. Like the house that Elizabeth believed was watching and judging her, the narrative of Thornfield seems to have a capacity to draw in those who study it too closely, blurring the lines between observer and subject. Dr. Jenkins, who completed her dissertation on the case in 1964, appears to have been more resilient to its psychological effects. In a follow-up paper published in the Journal of Historical Psychology in 1966, she wrote, "The Thornfield case exemplifies what I call narrative contagion, the tendency of certain historical narratives to exert a psychological influence on those who study them intensively. Professor Caldwell's experience suggests that the boundaries between researcher and subject can become dangerously permeable when dealing with cases of extreme psychological disturbance." The house that Elizabeth Thornfield believed was alive with watching, judging presences becomes, for the unwary researcher, a metaphorical structure that can entrap the mind in similar patterns of thought. In 1967, shortly before his medical leave, Professor Caldwell made one final contribution to the Thornfield research. Using contacts at various historical societies and university archives, he managed to trace Samuel's origins to a plantation in North Carolina owned by the Crawford family. The records indicated that Samuel had been born on the Crawford plantation in 1810, the son of a skilled carpenter who had taught his trade to his son. Most significantly, Caldwell discovered a bill of sale indicating that Colonel Thornfield had made a special trip to North Carolina specifically to purchase Samuel in 1838, paying considerably above market value for him. This discovery raised new questions about Colonel Thornfield's interest in Samuel. Why would a Virginia plantation owner travel to North Carolina to purchase a specific slave at a premium price? The Crawford plantation records offered a possible explanation. An inventory from 1837 listed Samuel as literate, skilled in carpentry, drafting, and architectural design. Such a combination of skills would have been rare and valuable, particularly to someone like Colonel Thornfield, who, according to county records, had been planning significant renovations to the east wing of his house around that time. A series of architectural drawings found among Colonel Thornfield's papers, dated 1839 to 1840, appeared to be in a hand different from his own, possibly Samuel's work. The drawings detail extensive modifications to the east wing, including the library where Elizabeth and Samuel would later be discovered together. Most notably, the plans include several hidden spaces between walls, concealed storage compartments, and the secret staircase to the cellar that Elizabeth would later describe in her journal. Dr. Jenkins, in her analysis of these findings, suggests that the architectural modifications to Thornfield may have served a dual purpose: practical storage and concealment of secrets. The hidden spaces that Samuel designed for Colonel Thornfield, she writes, would later become the physical manifestation of Elizabeth's psychological compartmentalization, spaces where forbidden desires could be concealed yet preserved, hidden from society's judgment, yet accessible to those who knew where to look. The relationship between Colonel Thornfield and Samuel, as suggested by these documents, adds another layer of complexity to the psychological dynamics at play in the household after the Colonel's death. If Samuel had worked closely with Colonel Thornfield on these architectural modifications, he would have had intimate knowledge of the house's secrets, both architectural and perhaps personal. His subsequent relationship with Elizabeth takes on new dimensions in this light, suggesting a possible transference of loyalty, knowledge, and intimacy from husband to wife. A tantalizing hint appears in one of Elizabeth's earliest journal entries after her husband's death, dated January 20th, 1842. S. approached me today regarding the continuation of certain projects J. had commissioned before his passing. I was unaware of these plans and found S.'s knowledge of my husband's intentions somewhat disconcerting. There are, it seems, aspects of this house and of J.'s mind that remain unknown to me, though apparently not to S. This entry suggests that Samuel may have initiated the increased contact with Elizabeth, perhaps recognizing in her a potential ally or protector in the uncertain period following Colonel Thornfield's death. The power dynamics of their subsequent relationship would have been extraordinarily complex. Samuel possessed knowledge and skills that Elizabeth needed, while she held absolute legal power over his person and fate. The psychological horror of the Thornfield case lies in this twisted web of power, knowledge, desire, and dependency, a web in which both Elizabeth and Samuel became fatally entangled. The house itself, with its watching walls and hidden spaces, serves as both the physical setting and psychological metaphor for their doomed relationship. In 1968, the Virginia Historical Commission briefly considered designating the former Thornfield site as a location of historical significance, but ultimately declined to do so, citing the sensitive nature of the historical events associated with the property and the lack of surviving structures. A small brass plaque was installed at the entrance to the property in 1970, bearing only the dates of the house's construction and destruction, with no mention of Elizabeth Thornfield, Samuel, or the tragic events that unfolded there. The site has since become something of a pilgrimage destination for those interested in historical psychology and the darker aspects of plantation history. Visitors occasionally report unusual experiences, sudden temperature drops, the feeling of being watched, unexplained sounds that resemble whispers or footsteps. While such reports can be readily explained by the power of suggestion and the eerie atmosphere of the overgrown property, they add to the mystique surrounding the Thornfield case. A local tour guide who has brought groups to the site for over 20 years told a researcher in 2001, "There's something about that place that gets under your skin." I've taken folks to dozens of old plantation sites across Virginia, and many have darker histories than Thornfield, more violence, more suffering. But there's something different about Thornfield. It's the psychological aspect, I think. The idea of those walls, watching, listening, remembering. People who hear the story can't help but look at old houses differently afterward, wondering what secrets might be embedded in their walls. This lasting psychological impact may be the true horror of the Thornfield case, not just what happened to Elizabeth and Samuel, but how their story affects those who encounter it, even centuries later. The house that Elizabeth believed was alive with watching presences becomes, for those who hear her story, a metaphor for the hidden spaces within our own minds, where forbidden thoughts and desires might be concealed, yet never truly forgotten. Professor Caldwell, after his recovery and return to academic work in 1970, wrote a final reflection on the case that was found among his papers after his death in 1982. The tragedy of Elizabeth Thornfield lies not in her forbidden desire for Samuel, but in her inability to imagine a world where such desire need not be forbidden. The house she believed was watching and judging her was simply a projection of the societal constraints she had internalized so deeply that she could no longer distinguish between external judgment and her own self-condemnation. In her madness, she perceived the walls as alive with watching eyes and listening ears. But the truly terrifying insight of her story is that she was right, not literally, but metaphorically. The physical structures we build around ourselves do indeed watch and judge us, not as conscious entities, but as manifestations of the social orders they embody and enforce. In 1975, a graduate student in archaeology conducting research at the former Thornfield site made a discovery that added yet another layer to this complex psychological horror story. While examining the foundations of what had been the east wing of the house, she uncovered a small cavity in the stone foundation that had been sealed with newer mortar, suggesting it had been opened and resealed at some point after the house's initial construction. Inside this cavity was a small tin box, severely damaged by time and the fire that had destroyed the house, but still intact enough to preserve its contents. A folded piece of parchment containing what appeared to be a letter, written in a careful hand, that experts later identified as likely belonging to Samuel. The letter, dated November 8, 1842, just 4 days before the fatal discovery in the library, reads, "E. The preparations are complete. The papers are where we discussed, to be collected when needed. On Friday night, when the house is still, I will meet you at the appointed place. By dawn, we will be beyond their reach. Have courage for what lies ahead. Remember that walls that appear solid may still contain doors if one knows where to look." S. This discovery confirms that Elizabeth and Samuel had indeed been planning to flee together, as hinted at in Elizabeth's unsent letter to her sister. The reference to papers where we discussed suggests they had made practical arrangements for their escape, possibly including forged travel documents that would have been necessary for Samuel to move freely as a free man rather than an escaped slave. Most intriguing is the philosophical reflection in the final line about walls containing doors, if one knows where to look, a sentiment that echoes Elizabeth's journal entry about the house showing her a new room filled with light. This suggests that Samuel shared, at least to some extent, Elizabeth's metaphorical thinking about the house and its hidden possibilities. The fact that this letter was concealed within the very foundations of the house adds a poignant physical dimension to the psychological compartmentalization that characterized Elizabeth and Samuel's relationship. Their forbidden connection, like the letter itself, was literally embedded within the structure of Thornfield, hidden from view yet integral to its secret history. A forensic analysis of the letter conducted in 1976 revealed something even more disturbing: traces of blood on the lower corner of the parchment. While DNA testing was not available at that time, the position and pattern of the bloodstain led investigators to speculate that the letter may have been concealed in the foundation after Samuel's death, possibly by someone who had blood on their hands at the time. This raises the chilling possibility that Elizabeth herself may have hidden the letter after Samuel's death, perhaps as a form of memorial or secret testament to their relationship. If so, the bloodstains might have come from her own hands, metaphorically, if not literally, stained with Samuel's blood through her role in his arrest and subsequent death. Dr. Jenkins, when informed of this discovery, wrote in a supplementary analysis, "The concealment of Samuel's letter within the physical foundation of Thornfield represents a powerful psychological gesture, a literal burying of evidence that parallels Elizabeth's psychological burial of her guilt and grief. If, as seems likely, she was the one who hid the letter after his death, this act suggests a desperate attempt to preserve some tangible connection to him, even as she prepared to abandon Thornfield and the life she had known." The blood traces add a macabre element that aligns with the Gothic sensibilities evident in Elizabeth's journal writings, a symbolic marking of the letter with the physical evidence of their tragedy. The final months of Elizabeth's life following her return to Boston are documented in a series of letters between her sister Margaret and various physicians consulted about her condition. These letters, discovered in the archives of Massachusetts General Hospital in 1980, paint a picture of progressive psychological deterioration despite the best medical care available at the time. A letter from Dr. Jonathan Pierce to Margaret Wilcox, dated February 12, 1844, 3 months before Elizabeth's death, describes her condition in terms that modern clinicians might recognize as severe depression with psychotic features. "Your sister continues to decline despite our best efforts. She takes little nourishment and speaks only rarely, usually to address individuals who are not present. Most concerning is her fixed delusion regarding the walls of your home, which she insists are the same walls despite having been removed from Virginia some 15 months ago. She has been observed pressing her ear against the wallpaper for hours at a time, apparently listening for voices. When questioned, she states only that she is waiting for the house to forgive her. I regret to inform you that I see little prospect of improvement given the entrenched nature of these delusions." This description suggests that Elizabeth's psychological fixation on the watching, judging house had become completely detached from the physical structure of Thornfield itself, transforming into a purely psychological manifestation that followed her to Boston. The walls of any house had become, in her disturbed perception, extensions of the witnessing presence she had first projected onto Thornfield. The cause of death listed on Elizabeth's death certificate, brain fever, was a common 19th century diagnosis for fatal cases of extreme psychological disturbance. Modern medical historians reviewing the described symptoms suggest she may have died from a combination of severe malnutrition, dehydration, and possibly an intentional or accidental overdose of the laudanum that was routinely prescribed for her nervous condition. A final letter from Margaret to a friend, dated June 2, 1844, shortly after Elizabeth's death, contains a disturbing detail that was not included in any official records. In her final hours, as the end approached, Elizabeth suddenly became more lucid than she had been in months. She sat up in bed, her eyes clear and focused for the first time in so long, and said the most peculiar thing. "The house has finally opened its door to me, Margaret. I can see Samuel waiting on the other side." Then she smiled, truly smiled, the first genuine expression of peace I had seen on her face since her return from Virginia, and lay back on her pillows. She was gone before dawn. This account of Elizabeth's final moments suggests that even in death, the metaphor of the house with its hidden rooms and concealed doors remained central to her understanding of her experience. The psychological compartmentalization that had begun as a necessary response to social constraints had ultimately become the framework through which she perceived reality itself, even at the threshold of death. The story of Elizabeth Thornfield and Samuel represents a unique case study in historical psychology, a documented descent into obsession, paranoia, and eventual psychological collapse triggered by the collision of forbidden desire with rigid social constraints. The architectural metaphors that pervade the case, watching walls, hidden rooms, concealed staircases, serve as powerful representations of the psychological compartmentalization that characterized both Elizabeth's mind and the society in which she lived. Dr. Jenkins, in the conclusion of her landmark study of the case, writes, "The Thornfield incident offers a unique window into the psychological costs of maintaining a social order built on fundamental inequalities and rigid hierarchies. Elizabeth Thornfield's descent into madness represents not an individual pathology, but a systemic one, the inevitable psychological fracturing that occurs when human desires collide with inhuman constraints. The house that she believed was watching and judging her was, in the final analysis, simply a physical manifestation of the oppressive social structure she had internalized so completely that she could no longer distinguish between its judgments and her own. The former Thornfield plantation is now private property, with no remaining structures visible above ground. The foundation stones that once supported the grand house with its watching walls and hidden spaces lie buried beneath decades of soil and vegetation, gradually being reclaimed by the Virginia wilderness. Yet the psychological horror of Elizabeth Thornfield's story continues to resonate with those who encounter it, a reminder that the most terrifying haunted houses are not those inhabited by supernatural presences, but those that become physical embodiments of our own psychological compartmentalization, projection, and denial. As you sit listening to this account, perhaps in a house with walls of your own, consider the spaces hidden within those walls. Not physical spaces necessarily, but psychological ones. The compartments where uncomfortable truths might be concealed, desires hidden, judgments internalized. For the true horror of the Thornfield case lies not in its historical specificity, but in its psychological universality, the recognition that each of us, to some degree, lives within watching walls of our own construction, haunted not by external ghosts, but by the aspects of ourselves we choose to conceal, contain, or deny. The walls of Thornfield have long since crumbled to dust. Elizabeth and Samuel have been dead for over a century and a half. Yet the psychological architecture they inhabited, the structure of power, desire, judgment, and fear, remains recognizable even today. It is this recognition, this uncomfortable resonance across time and circumstance, that gives the Thornfield case its lasting power as a study in psychological horror. Sleep well, if you can, within the walls of your own making, and perhaps in the darkest hours of the night, pause to listen, not for supernatural whispers or phantom footsteps, but for the quieter sounds of your own hidden truths, moving restlessly within the spaces you have built to contain them. For as Elizabeth Thornfield discovered too late, walls that appear impermeable may still contain doors if one knows where to look, knows where. The metal box discovered in the Thornfield Foundation in 1975 was donated to the Virginia Historical Society, where it remains in their archives, along with the blood-stained letter it contained. The X marked on the map found in 1958 continues to intrigue researchers, though the consensus now is that whatever may have been buried at that location, perhaps additional letters, forged travel papers, or mementos of Elizabeth and Samuel's relationship, has been lost to time and the elements. Professor Caldwell's collection of Thornfield research materials, including his reconstructed floor plans, soil samples, and brick fragments, was donated to the University of Virginia Archives following his death. A small exhibition of these materials was mounted in 1985, but was closed prematurely following complaints from several visitors who reported feeling inexplicably disturbed or watched while viewing the displays. Her final publication before her retirement in 1989 was a comparative analysis of architectural metaphors in psychological narratives across cultures and time periods, in which the Thornfield case featured prominently as a quintessential example of the house as psychological mirror. As for the Thornfield site itself, the current owners have declined all requests from researchers and historians to conduct further archaeological investigations, citing a desire for privacy and, according to one local rumor, a series of unsettling experiences on the property that they prefer not to discuss publicly. Eleanor Jenkins went on to become a pioneer in the field of historical psychology, using the methodologies she developed in her study of the Thornfield case to analyze other instances of psychological disturbance in historical contexts. And so the story of Elizabeth Thornfield Samuel and the watching walls of their shared prison fades gradually into the mists of history, remembered by few, understood by fewer still. Yet the psychological truths it embodies remain as relevant today as they were in 1842, that the structures we build around ourselves, both physical and social, have the power to shape our perceptions, constrain our desires, and ultimately determine the boundaries of our reality. The most profound horror of the Thornfield case lies in this recognition that the walls that confined Elizabeth and Samuel were not merely physical barriers of wood and stone, but psychological constructs built and maintained by a society determined to keep certain doors forever closed, certain rooms forever hidden, certain connections forever forbidden. In her madness, Elizabeth perceived these walls as alive, watching, judging. In her clarity, we might recognize that she was right.